Good morning. My name is Jason Newton, and I'm here to share with you some of what I'm learning in retirement. And I'm glad to be here at your program down here in the Quinebaug Valley. I've spent a good bit of time traveling through this area, and I'll share that with you over the course of the next hour or so. You're going to see a whole lot of pictures, and I'll be telling you some of the stories I'm learning going along down through. And let's see. Actually, in preparing for this, I have done a number of other presentations across Connecticut, and there's a growing interest in this topic. And learning in retirement, I hadn't really thought of this until I had to actually prepare for this group. It brings back memories of what I did on my summer vacation kind of assignment. That instead of what I did on my summer vacation, it's what I'm doing in retirement. And a focus for me has been, now that I have the luxury of time and as retired as a school psychologist and special ed administrator, I am now able to focus on some of those things that we put off until we have time, looking at family history as a project and establishing some of the roots of where I came from in my family. And I found out that my family, I have a whole lot of cousins out there, probably tens of thousands of cousins I'm finding out. And learning how to share the story that of this journey in finding the Old Connecticut Path and connecting with others. Things have changed in how we share things, and the internet has opened up some great opportunities for us to share our stories out there, not just from town to town, but actually from continent to continent. And then finally, as we all reach that stage in our lives where we have the time to reflect, it's looking at leaving a legacy behind, passing something on for the future generations. So I guess if you take this presentation in context of what I did on my summer vacation / now retirement, you'll get an idea of some of the things that I've been doing, and maybe that'll connect with where you're coming from. And digging into my family tree, it all goes back to, I found my grandparents, Lydia Dimmick and Irwin Newton, these were my father's parents. Growing up, explaining their relationship was that we were told Dad's father's mother married Dad's mother's father. Now, if you're real quick in figuring that out, it took me quite a few decades to figure out that my grandparents were actually stepbrother and stepsister. So we had the bringing together of two different families, but they both had long, deep Connecticut roots. They were up in the hills of Vermont, where my family migrated from Connecticut. And in this family tree, we have the immigrant ancestor, Reverend Roger Newton, who entered Cambridge University in 1636 at King's College. Came over to finish his studies at that new school that was a branch of Cambridge that's over on the river. Later it was named Harvard. And in 1640, he ran off to Connecticut and married a hooker. And that's our family. That was what I knew in the family story until I kept digging into this a little bit further. And I found out that the folks here in Connecticut can relate to this because in Connecticut we have a hooker day. And the hooker name gets further honored by the Hooker Parade, which is quite a colorful event. And of course, Connecticut really knows how to celebrate with hooker beer. So the name is preserved in good fun here in Connecticut. But I want you to all be aware that Massachusetts, they have a real connection to the hooker name too. And if you go on down to the State House, you can entered the State House as the politicians do from across Massachusetts through the Hooker Gate. So we have a connection with the Hooker name, but I really didn't grow up with the story of Thomas Hooker in my learning or my schooling, as I didn't grow up in Connecticut. I'm just a visitor. So I had to do some digging to go back and find out what the story was. And hopefully there's more to the story than what we're now doing to the name Hooker. And along the way in my exploration, there's a monument up in Ashford, the trail, and it has three names on it. It has John Oldham, who came down, who was reported to be the first white Englishman to come down to Connecticut in 1633. John Wareham, who led the congregation from Dorchester down to Windsor in 1635, and Thomas Hooker. And in looking further into this in my family relationship, since I'm descended from Thomas Hooker, I forget the connection with Thomas Hooker. My Reverend Roger Hooker ran up to Connecticut and married a Hooker, Mary Hooker, the daughter of Thomas Hooker. And he actually lived in the Hooker household, prepared for the ministry. So forgive me for skipping over there, but the Hooker connection really ties into those three towns of Windsor, Hartford, and Wethersfield that were established by John Wareham, John Oldham, and Thomas Hooker. And looking further into this, I found I probably have tens of thousands of cousins. We're going back about 12 generations to Thomas Hooker for me. I found that looking at those monuments in the towns of Wethersfield, Windsor, and Hartford, that I have a connection with a whole bunch of the founders, and they had lots of children, and their children married each other's children, and so you wind up with lots of connections back to these three towns. So I discovered that the stream ran much deeper than just a connection to Thomas Hooker and Roger Newton. But really, for me to learn more about this in retirement, I had to dig into, well, who was this person, Thomas Hooker, that has, despite the parade and the beer and the Hooker Gate, actually has a place in the history of Connecticut, and I'd suggest probably the history of the United States, and is honored downtown in Hartford with statues, monuments at the center of town at the old State House. And up on the State House, he has an important place of honor. That Hooker was a premier speaker, scholar at Cambridge University, a minister of a congregation that they called him to be their minister here in America, a reformer, because he had some beliefs that he was able to work with the towns to be able to share and establish here. And a founder, we start saying, well, he's a founder, he's involved in the founding of Hartford and Connecticut. The New England Confederation, which I really didn't know much about, but was really the first instance of colonial governments working together. So as a precursor to what we see as the colonies later working together during the American Revolution. A statesman, he was regarded as a person to call on to help resolve conflicts and problems. And this lofty one, father of American democracy. So it's a whole big bag of things that I had to learn about Thomas Hooker. And the real brief piece of his history here, taking an important place in England, going back to Chelmsford, is that Thomas Hooker was a lecturer in Chelmsford. And this drew growing crowds. He was one of the most outstanding preachers of his time. And others, his contemporaries in the ministry, recognized that no one else could not only bring the scriptures into practical terms, but could convey it in a way that the crowds would carry that information into their lives. So he was a powerful influence in the community there, and powerful influences wind up meeting resistance. one part of the resistance was in King Charles I, who declared basically, in modern terms, we'd say, King Charles said, it's my way or the highway. You do it according to the established church, and you follow the strictures of the church, or you're in trouble. And Thomas Hooker was really, I've heard comparisons that he was the John the Baptist of his time, calling to make way for change. And so he was rocking the King's boat. And during that time, Hooker and his family, his wife Susanna and their young children, lived just outside of Chelmsford and the Cuckoo's Farm at Little Baydown. And it's still there. I hope to visit somewhere in the future in my travels along this journey. And the significance of this place is that not just that Hooker lived there, but all the ministers from the surrounding area traveled to Little Baydown to meet with Thomas Hooker on a regular basis. And what was happening was the planning for establishing a new order that would be a just society, a more godly society, that they hoped to establish in England. The other bit of resistance was William Laud, who was the Bishop of London and had oversight of Chelmsford. And because Thomas Hooker was drawing such crowds and having such an influence and a disruption against the order of the established church and the king, had Thomas Hooker removed from his lectureship. And ultimately, he started digging into the dirt. They had secret police and spies following Thomas Hooker. And ultimately, a warrant was set for his appearance in a high chamber or star court, star chamber. And this was before habeas corpus, so if he was seized, he might well have died in jail. There was a serious effort to suppress Puritans and those who were the followers of ministers like Thomas Hooker to the point of imprisonment. Now, Laud comes into this story because there was an effort to change and a hope to change things in England. But William Laud reached a point where in 1633 he reached the high post of Archbishop of Canterbury, which is like the Pope in the English church. And there was a great migration at that point, and that included Thomas Hooker and a number of the other notable ministers and leaders. And it became known as the Laudian migration, and most came to Massachusetts and then spread out from there. Now, before Thomas Hooker left England, he preached. His last sermon was recorded that he said there will be a war. And his words were prophetic because there was, in fact, a civil war. And I know when we think of the English, Ron, we think the English civil war might be around the tiddlywinks. But it was a bloody period between 1640 and 1660 that hundreds of thousands of people were affected, killed, lost their lives. Among the people who lost their lives, going back to those two resisting forces, William Laud was executed. And think of this, the king, King Charles, was executed. So the king was overthrown during this period, after Thomas Hooker had left. But Hooker brought with him the notions of the planned changes that they hoped to accomplish in England. When Laud reached Archbishop of Canterbury, he and many others realized that they couldn't do it there. They had to create a new England here in America. And that set the seeds for the roots of the American Revolution. Now, they came on a 2-month journey. I think Carnival cruise, might have been an upgrade from what they went through, but not by much. Here we can see, imagine 200 people spending 2 months below deck crossing the Atlantic. They were fortunate they got a summer crossing. There were winter crossings that we could imagine would be an ordeal of unimaginable proportion. And they arrived at a planned community. And when I say Newtown was a planned community, it later became Cambridge. The original plan was that Newtown would become the capital of the Massachusetts colony. That got moved across the river, and they haven't let it out of there since. But this was a comfortable community that they were in, and Thomas Hooker was the first minister there. But as soon as they arrived, they began their planning for a journey to Connecticut. It wasn't their intention as a congregation to stay where life was comfortable and good there on the coast. And there was resistance to letting them go until 1635, 1636. And so in 1636, Governor Winthrop recorded in his journal that Thomas Hooker and most of his congregation, I'll move back out of your way here. A little more? Okay, sorry about that. That most of his congregation left for Connecticut. And they were driving 160 cattle, which factors into this. Cattle don't move too quickly. And they were traveling with families. And they said drinking the milk along the way. I think they had some other provisions. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Now there's a tradition in Connecticut, and that's grown along the way. This is from the State House. There's a relief at the State House showing the Hooker's journey, that Susanna Hooker was an invalid that was carried across to Connecticut. And doing a little research and probing on this, that Susanna, you remember that 2-month journey? That was in July and August. In that following November, she gave birth to their youngest child, Samuel. So Susanna was pregnant below deck for 2 months. And just as a note here, all Hookers, those who have a Hooker name, are descended through this young boy, Samuel. So I think in considering this and the fact that at the time they traveled in 1636, they had 5 young children. 3 of the 5 were under 6 years of age and traveling with a 2-year, almost 3-year-old child. I think Susanna might have said, listen, Tom, you know, I was with you while you were in exile. I was with you on that 2-month trip. But walking to Connecticut, I don't think so. So I think in family harmony, he may have come up with the idea, well, how about if we get you a ride? And it was a horse-drawn litter that carried her and her young son to Connecticut. And family story is that my ancestor, Mary Hooker, walked beside her mother from Cambridge down to Connecticut, down to Hartford, and helped take care of the children. Now, they took about 2 weeks, is the legend here, a fortnight, to come through the woods and arrive in the wilderness here into Connecticut. And there was no community, so they had great work to establish homes here in Connecticut. But their work wasn't done. And within 2 years, Thomas Hooker was lecturing the freemen of the towns of Hartford, Windsor, Wethersfield, in May 1638. And he used a passage from Deuteronomy about choosing wise leaders. And within the explication, the telling of what the practical application of the passage was, he pointed out 3 things. The first was that their ability to make choices and choose leaders was a gift from God. The second was that since this is a gift from God, that each of them is able to make this choice, they must use the choice wisely. They must choose leaders who are concerned for the good of the whole. And I think as I reflect on this, their understanding of the good of the whole would be the good of the congregation. Even though it was the three towns, their understanding of the world would be the good of a congregation. And the third thing was that as they had this God-given right to establish a government and select leaders, they also had the right to limit those leaders. If the leaders did not meet their responsibilities to serve the good of the whole of the congregation, they could be removed, and that there were limits on their power. So this was a remarkable lecture, and in combination with the work of Roger Ludlow, who was from Windsor, in 1639, in January 14, which, if you want to send me a card, it's my birthday also, that the free men of the three towns voted to ratify the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which was the first written constitution to establish a government. And in later years, those who looked at this had said, this is really the foundation of American democracy, the first step there. That the fundamental orders, if we think about what was happening in England and what they came to do to establish a new order here in America, that the fundamental orders really had two parts. There was a preamble, which as you read it, and I did read it, is the story translated into the document of Hooker's lecture, and the understanding of we the people have this authority to do the creation of a government and what our purpose is. And that it really is a covenant between God gave them the authority to create a government. And the second part of it, which is strongly the work of Ludlow, the lawyer, were the orders. And the orders, when you read them and you understand what was happening in England, were the corrections to make a just society and to put into law a form that described the rights of people, the protections of the people, and the limits on government. And throughout this, one of the key things is all the other colonies had charters establishing their government that were granted by the king. And here on the Connecticut, we have a government created by the people that has no mention anywhere in it of the king. It truly was the people's document. And so as we look at this and you start lining them up, it really was the grandfather of the Declaration of the Independence and the U.S. Constitution. You read them side by side, especially the preambles, you say, there's a connection here that's going down through time. So my challenge was in finding, I thought it would be easy. I'm fortunate that all the genealogical research of my family had been done by my uncle. So I figured, well, in my retirement, I'll take on the challenge of, kind of following their path and seeing what's there today. From the Common in Cambridge across from Harvard, on down to Newtown, which they called Newtown, which actually later became Hartford. And the journey begins, and there are three things that I found that as I visited the Green in Cambridge, is that three things that affected the formation of the U.S. in our nation's history. The first is the establishment of college at Cambridge, which later became Harvard. And as we look in America, the establishment of Harvard set in motion the establishment of many other colleges and universities across America and the place of higher education. So they'd say at Harvard that that was the most significant event in shaping America. Another event that happened there was in 1775 that George Washington assumed command of all the militias that were formed, came together after Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. And from those militias, of the towns and the states, he formed the Continental Army, representing the entire, all the colonies together. And he also established that the military was subordinate to the elected authority. And off in a corner there is a mention of Thomas Hooker leaving for Connecticut from the Common. So you can go and visit the Common in Cambridge and see those three pieces. My starting journey of the journey began there on the Common. And looking at the history, there is some history of the story of the visions of the trip through Thomas Hutchinson, who was governor in the colonial era in Massachusetts, wrote in his history that they traveled for 2 weeks with a compass in hand through the wilderness. They were kind of just trying to find a way. Others had this kind of romantic view that you'd see in the Hudson River type view. It was a walk in the park. It probably was much more challenging than a walk in the park, but they definitely had a plan. I was a little disturbed when I found that the historians of Connecticut tried to parse this out. And the Connecticut Historic Commission came down in 1998 and said, we have no evidence that this ever happened. They couldn't explain how they got here, they just showed up. But fortunately, my journey was helped along the way by the strong traditions of the towns that were along the route, and the many markers to commemorate the journey along the path. And further, as I got into meeting people who live in Woodstock and Eastford and Ashford and on going across the hills, I had people approaching me saying, you know, my family has a piece of land where they were told that it's been passed down that that's where the path came through. So even today, there's an oral tradition that's been handed down of this migration coming through. So in looking at this, it passed for it was a 2-week journey through the wilderness. And at that point, if those of you who travel east of here, about Route 128 was the wilderness. Those of us who live in Massachusetts, the people in Boston still think that. Probably doesn't happen here in Connecticut. Hartford is, I'm sure, very attuned to your needs out here in the Quinebaug Valley. But they were in Indian country, and that brought up some issues of, you know, what was it like traveling through Indian country? And actually, they had good relations with the natives, and the natives and the chiefs actually invited them down to Connecticut. Probably their descendants might live and say, we really regret inviting you all, would you please leave? But they invited them down to Connecticut. There have been some attempts to draw it across, and one was done by Harold Ayers. There were several others that have looked. This one I've actually followed and seems to work out the best. That followed the route of John Eliot and the praying villages as a guide to where the path was, and the towns along that route celebrate that. And across from Woodstock, across the hills of Wyndham County, on down to Hartford. And doing some assumptions of my own, I also figured that since Windsor and Wethersfield were being established in the same time, they're likely to have followed somewhat, probably the same path. Now those cows, anyone here have experience driving cows to the barn? Cows have a tendency to move slowly and at their own, you know, you have to kind of move them along. They aren't particularly quick nor intelligent. So 10 miles a day is about what I figured a group driving cows, walking with women and children along a path where there were no bridges. So it was wild country. So 10 miles a day and following the route that I've been able to track, you'd be out about Weston and about 128 on the first day, down to Framingham, then third day off to Hopkinton. There's some tradition of their camping there at Whitehall Pond, and then down to Sutton in that area on the fourth day. and we bring you down to Webster. Somewhere in the Woodstock area, there's a tradition on Pine Hill in Ashford of there being an encampment of the hooker party along the way, and down to the Willimantic River, and then finally down the Quinebaug Valley to the crossing at Hartford. With a branch off to Windsor, there is some history of the route going from Holland up around the north end of Shinnecock Lake to Windsor, and also down to New Weathersfield. Connecticut has some history of disagreement on this, of a highway and a lowway. The lowway looks to be like along Route 44, pretty much down through Bolton Notch, which, if you want to drive, that's one way to go, but if you really want to be able to experience some of the woods, you can travel across the Highlands, which is the highway that I've been following in green. And you'll get a chance to see it in a few minutes here. Here in the valley, Ellen Larned was a librarian up in Thompson. In 1874, she wrote The History of Windham County, where she collected information from folks, the oral traditions. And tucked away in her book was this map, which you have actually a piece of it in your handout. And on it, she showed the route of what oral tradition handed down through time was that the path came across Windham County. And you'll see, you can look in your folder there, a little zoom in on it like this. There are some places that I'll get to a little later in the presentation. You can go and you can actually visit and walk to get a sense of what the life was along the path. But Windham County would have come down right through Thompson, Woodstock, Eastford to Crystal Pond, across Ashford, Billington, and down to the Willimantic Valley across Rome. So we'll take a little walk here across the last Green Valley. And I've stretched it a little bit from West Sutton. And let's see if my video will work. While I talk, you can watch the pictures here. You get a sense that one of the things that really surprised me in setting out on this journey is that from West Sutton here, the area that the Manchog Crane Village was that John Eliot established, there's this expansive wilderness that you can walk in today that gives you some sense of what was the world like in 1636 and when the pioneers were traveling across, that there's a 3-mile stretch from West Sutton down to Webster where you're really stepping back in time. And there are some remains of later buildings, bridges, stonework there that gives you some sense of this has been a path that's been in long use down to Webster. And crossing the lake in Webster, then it heads down into Dudley for a short distance before entering Connecticut down in Thompson. So if you're familiar with New Boston Road area in Dudley, right along in that corridor comes down into, we should be right into Thompson. And there's a remarkable old pathway hidden away heading down towards the Quinebaug River. And you see artifacts along the way, and old artifacts of bridges leading down to the Quinebaug River. And the Quinebaug would have been one of the great challenges that they faced. There were no bridges at that time. So they'd have to wade across. As they reach Woodstock, Woodstock today is an extraordinarily beautiful place to travel. They traveled there, and there was a native settlement there, the Wigwaquasets, and there was a path that the Woodstock Historical Society has now had designated as part of the National Historic Register. And they've led walks along the Old Connecticut Path, as you see here, leading along the path to commemorate it. Here we're traveling a little further west in Woodstock, over the hill to Crystal Pond, and the woodlands there. So it was remarkable in making this journey that there's so much wilderness preserved in this land, going across to Ashford, that we can visit today. Now, I don't want you to leave thinking that it's all connected. There are some disruptions along the way. But I found that there are places that you can go that really evoke that feeling of the wilderness. And if you allow your imaginations to go free, you can begin to get a sense of what was it that they must have experienced on this walk, and how fortunate we are that there's something like it left. In the history of the path, there's the story of the Chisholm brothers. David Chisholm and Charles Chisholm grew up in Ashford, up on Axe Factory Road. It's actually Westford. They'd say, it's Ashford. And David Chisholm researched the stories and drew the map showing the route of the path across Eastford and Ashford. And following it out, it actually works. And David Chisholm, or Charles Chisholm, his brother, gave some description of what it was like living along the path. And he said he and his brother David, they had to walk about a mile from their house on Axe Factory Road over to the old school. They had to cross the Bigelow Brook, and there was this bridge. And you go there today, there's no bridge, but the abutment's still there. And he said they knew they often crossed the river on a series of stones that were set about 100 feet up from the bridge. And the oral tradition that they had heard was that those stones were placed when it was a footpath leading to Connecticut. And they're massive stones. Here we see one of them right in the center, and you say, well, where are the rest? Well, Harold Ayers dug this out in the Woodstock Historical Society. Harold Ayers wrote the book, The Great Trail of New England, went down with Chisholm and walked across it in about 1935. He was going to go down with him after the hurricane in 1938, but Chisholm passed away. So he went later, and the stones had been washed away by the flood from the hurricane. So there's one remaining. Let's see if I can do this. There's one remaining there that you saw. Here's another one that's been washed down the stream. And some of the others are probably not too far in here. So there was a tradition of a crossing. This is in Yale Forest and Natchog State Forest, so it's preserved for future generations. The other tradition that was recorded was that the Hooker party, in their journey, camped and stayed overnight at Pine Hill in Ashford. And there's some who thought that was down like near the center of Ashford on Route 44, but Pine Hill was actually up at the north end of town. In doing the research, Charles Chisholm said they camped up on the Pine Hill that was behind their farm. And it was also a place where the Baptist Society held their open-air church meetings. And in the history of Ashford, I found the Pine Hill Baptist Church gathering on Pine Hill on Axe Factory Road. And you can go, if you drive up Eastford Road in Ashford, and you can look up the hill, and this is a view of Pine Hill. And at the top of the hill, running right parallel to the road, there's another much earlier roadway. And Charles Chisholm described, he said, there was a tradition that there was a piece of land on their property that had never been plowed. That was where the Old Connecticut Path crossed. And if you go up there today, this is a picture of it. There's a section of early colonial road that runs parallel to it that matches right with the position that David Chisholm had. I believe that this is about as close as we can get in any point to what they were describing. I'm going to let the video run some slides here while I kind of talk about what was it like. And he said, we've seen some of the land that they've traveled through, and you'll see some more here. They were walking. There were no bridges. It was not an established road, but it was probably a well-identified trail by the natives. They had a guide, likely, to show them the way. They had to sleep on the ground. Meal preparation, I think, we in retirement have discovered crock pot cooking. Well, they had the great big kettle pot cooking, and so would prepare basically kind of a porridge, and might add beans and corn and salt beef or salt pork. They might have traded with the natives along the way, because there were Indian villages along the way, for food, for fish, for corn, for game. But we have to think that these were people who had lived their lives in England, in villages, spent 2 months at sea, crammed together, and then chose to walk this 2-week journey into the wilderness. And as beautiful as it is today, traveling across this day from Pine Hill on down to the Willimantic, we have to imagine they must have been just plain tired by then. And wondering, my God, what have we gotten ourselves into? I don't think any one of us would sign up as a guided vacation tour in retirement for their journey. So on that 9th day, they were close to being home. And climbing the hill up towards Path Hill in Holland, they were approaching the end of their journey. And I'm going to share with you, those of you, I heard someone say, yes, they're here, their ancestors went to Windsor. I'm going to share with you a little bit of the journey to Windsor. I'm working on the Hartford part now, but the Windsor part is just beautiful. And I found, today I rode through Paradise that John Adams wrote on his journey to Windsor. And if you go today, and I set up a driving tour and some things we'll hit a little bit later in the presentation, you can go and take the drive across from Holland through Ellington, East Windsor, South Windsor, and over Windsor. It's stunning. Why don't you take a look here while I talk about this notion of the land that they were coming to. Because it had a real effect on me when I saw it for the first time. That coming across Holland, you reach a point where you can begin to look out, I'll get a better picture in the future, you can begin to look down the Quinebaug Valley. And you come around Shenipsit Lake, and it's a beautiful, stunning dirt road. And then you have this vision of the Connecticut Valley. And it really affected me when I saw this for the first time and came down into Ellington. While they were thinking, my God, what have we gotten ourselves into crossing to the Willimantic? They must have been feeling, my God, what have been delivered to paradise. As we go across today, it's still a stunning landscape that they entered in the Connecticut Valley. And the area that we're traveling across here through Windsor, East Windsor, and South Windsor, at one time, this whole area was part of Windsor. And it was settled by the families who established Windsor, and later broke off into the smaller towns. And it was leading off to the crossing places. There were 3 ferries that I was able to identify. The original one, the Bissell Ferry site, 3rd ferry a little further down, and then I uncovered the fact that there was an actual hoarding place that they probably drove cattle across the river, across the Connecticut. Leading down to where we see the green in Windsor, where the first villages were established in Windsor. And the Farmington River Valley that comes into the Connecticut River there, providing a rich open valley area. So we have a rich history of places along this path that we can visit today. They had a feeling, I have to believe, that they had arrived in the Promised Land. It's just an incredible vista of the land that they must have seen if we put ourselves in their place. And we're very fortunate today that we can put ourselves not just in their place in our minds, but we can put ourselves in some of the places that they must have come to experience. It's a grand story that I found, and as I'm trying to understand it, one of the questions I had is, what happened to the story? It didn't seem like, when I first started this, I went on Google and figured, I'm going to find a million things written about this, and there really was next to nothing. So what happened to the story of their journey and what they did? And in thinking about this, looking at my own family, they had many children. There was a sense of expansion, and around those fires that they'd have in their homes, they would probably tell the stories of when they came. And when I came over from England, what it was, their children and their children's children and on down, they might have had part of that story, but they had their own stories. In my family, in 1777, our family history story is that my ancestor David Newton and his young family traveled up the Connecticut River in the dead of winter on ice from Connecticut to Vermont. They had many children, 16 children, lots of children, not unusual. And all the other families that came down had lots of children. And so there was an expansion, and those people going west up the Mohawk Valley and into Ohio and into the Midwest, and even further going across up through Nebraska and across the plains down to Texas, that they carried the stories, that the stories got translated as they went, from the story of coming from England to the story of travel to Vermont, to travel to the West. But there was another story that got bonded to it that I think made it very powerful for others who came later. And that's the story that I had to try and figure out. I'm walking through all this going, my God, this is so difficult. How hard it must have been for them to do this. What sustained them? And I really had to try and understand from their perspective, they're coming from England, what kept them going? Why didn't they just give up or just stay in Cambridge and live the good life there and have ivy-covered houses? There was a challenge there in understanding that. And symbols do mean something. The symbols for Connecticut, and again, I didn't grow up with this, I had to approach it fresh. There on the flag is a symbol, there are a set of symbols of the vines and the Latin phrase, which translates as "he who transplanted us still sustains." And going back in history, the colony of Connecticut, early in the 1640s, this seal or symbol goes back to the earliest years. It would have been the seal or symbol that those founders chose for their colony. So we begin to get an understanding of what was happening in their minds and how they might have seen it. That the vines represented the tribes of Israel. And we go back to Scripture. Being transplanted, and who transplanted? And looking at Puritan belief in coming to America, they saw themselves as a tribe that was on a mission to establish a godly, just society. And they were challenged by, I'm sure, what shall we tell our children as a question. What shall we tell our children about what we're choosing to do and why we're doing this? Because we must remember, as you saw, my own ancestor, Mary Hooker, was walking beside her mother, helping to care for 3 young children. This was not just young men coming to Connecticut, it was families that came to Connecticut. So what did they tell their children? And what kept them strong as a family and sustained them over the course? And I have to believe, as I started looking at the story to see where this might come and tie into their understanding of the world, We know that Thomas Hooker chose a passage from Deuteronomy while lecturing on the establishment of the fundamental orders. And there's a passage further down in Deuteronomy that almost perfectly tells the story of the people who came to Connecticut. And the passage there, it's, what shall we tell our children in the future? This was from the tribes of Israel. Tell them your God brought you out of oppression and bondage and sustained you and delivered you to the promised land, a land promised to your ancestors. And if you obey the laws of God, then you'll be sustained here, and you'll have a productive life in this promised land. And as I looked at this, in the parallels, this is written thousands of years ago in our Judeo-Christian tradition of the tribes of Israel and their story and what they told their children to sustain the story. This story was well known to the Puritans coming to Connecticut. And I can't help but imagine that the story that they told of their coming and the journey and the time was woven into the purpose that they came for, to establish a just society, and that they were fulfilling a mission that was divinely oriented. So we have two stories coming together, the literal story of here's what we did to come across, and then the spiritual story of we too were relieved from oppression in England and came across the ocean and across the wilderness and found ourselves in the promised land. So we take those two stories together, and I believe that the stories that got told going forward help form our American story. And that story, you don't have to be a descendant of someone who came on the Mayflower or came to Connecticut with Thomas Hooker or came to be one of the founders of the towns. I started thinking I have other ancestors, my grandparents on my mother's side. My grandmother came from the fields of Quebec. My grandfather came from Scotland. My wife and her grandparents came from Poland and the fields of Poland, and her grandmother came as a 17-year-old girl from Lithuania, not speaking any English, alone to America. We all have people in our families that came from somewhere else, and likely came out of a place where there was bondage, there was oppression, that did not afford them the opportunity for a good life. They came for what I believe is partly they heard the promise of the story of America. And if we say, where did that story come from? I have to think it comes from that wedding of the story of enduring hardships of a journey and the connection to a divine purpose. And that became, over time, it becomes translated as why are we traveling to Ohio? Why are we traveling to Nebraska? Why are we enduring long journeys across the continent? And the hardships that were entailed, that there was a purpose. So we all share in the story of the people who came, I think, through this shared purpose story of the American story, that it's a place of hope, of opportunity, a chance for release from oppression for those who come, And it's still there because we look and we see so many people who still yearn to come here and be part of it. I'm growing close to my time here, and I want to make sure I give you time for some questions, but I do have some assignment for you. This is a college program, and you know, you can't get out without having some assignments for long-term work. And I want this to be, you know, I'm an educator, so this has to be active learning. You can't just, you know, can't just sit back. You know, it's nice to sit back sometimes, but you know, getting involved is a good thing too. So I've got some assignments for you I'll share here, and then we'll take some questions and see what you think. First of all, if you haven't gone out, there's a number of ways to said, what did he say? And what's this about? There's a number of ways now with the internet that you can do it through the Old Connecticut Path website and some other things. One of the ways that I've found that it's been remarkable, I never could have imagined how Facebook connects people. There's an I started an Old Connecticut Path Facebook page. You can go on there and you can like, share, comment, and we'll call that active learning. And it's been interesting. I've had people, you know, someone will like something on there or posting, you know, try to do something every week, you know, with pictures like this. And I'm finding people, I get the last one I traced down, you find out, well, who is this person? It says, gee, I hope you'll be able to show me the way when I come for a visit. They were coming from a visit from Bristol, England. You know, it's amazing where people are seeing this. To get to the website, who would have ever thought that there would be a verb to Google? Well, there is such a thing now. You can literally type the long name to get there, or you can go on Google and type Old Connecticut Path. When I started this, there was maybe one entry that didn't have much information. Now it's all about me. So you can go and you can find anything that I've been doing is there on the website. If you go to the website, there's an introduction and a short video that you can, finding that you have to have video and pictures to keep people interested. And if you enter the site, there are some different sections. You can go visit for different purposes. Because I'm learning and this is evolving as a project, I'm trying to put things up there in a way that will be shared, and those who have an interest can go and explore. If you really do like videos, YouTube is another one of those things that I can't say that I have anything that gets hundreds of thousands of hits. We're up to about 13,000 views on the Old Connecticut Path videos. But if you go to Google and you hit the video selection instead of the search, they're all listed, and you can go check them out. Now, when I said I have lots of cousins, I'm fortunate my uncle Robert Newton compiled all the family history, and I posted it there in searchable form. And as I find other things that of these families that came, I put some links up in some of the places that you can go in and say, gee, am I a third cousin 26 times removed to Jason? You can do that. I've had other folks use it when they run into a dead end on their own research, and then they go, oh, then I'm related to you by this, and since we share an ancestor, then I now have 10 more steps back. So for some exploring, if now in retirement you're looking, saying, well, family history, well, how do we figure out this stuff? We're videoing today, and one of the ways, again, I'm finding that video is a powerful medium for being able to share information. Programs that I do that the video actually comes out that I sound like I'm halfway presentable and the video quality is good. I like to post them because what I'm finding is that there are people who can't be here. And you think that can't be here because, well, gee, something else was happening. They were having a potluck lunch up the road here in Killingly, and they said, I'll do that instead of being here. Not being here, I'm finding that there are people all across the country that are interested so that we can share this. So if you want to see this again in a couple weeks, it'll be there. I'm coming to believe that it's really important, not just for people to do it on a virtual level, watching videos and being on the web, but actually getting out and exploring. It's good for us all to get out of the house. We all remember those nice Sunday drives, and driving the country. Well, what I'm trying to do is connect these places along the path with some drives that you can take across Connecticut, and I've just completed segments so you can go from Webster on down to Windsor, but on country roads. And if you do this, click on it, you'll see that they're broken into segments, so you don't have to do it all at once. You can go out and explore, and if you do, let me see if I can pull it up here. I won't pull it up on my phone. I put them on a website that you can go to. There's a link that'll take you to every trail. And if you have either an iPhone or an Android phone, a smartphone, you can get a free app. And there's another term. We have to Google YouTube apps. Think of all the things we're learning in retirement here. You can get the app and then use it as a GPS to guide you along the path. So get out there and explore. You saw the pictures there. That last segment going over to Windsor is what you'd see along the driving tour. If you do go into this, now here's another one, Google Earth. I mean, who thought of this? You can pull down these driving tours into Google Earth, and if you see a spot along the way, you can click on it, and you can actually see what's down there at the ground level. And the last segment on this is that I've also, and in your brochure, you'll see that there's some walks along the way, some places that are public lands that you could get out and explore, working to develop in each of the towns places that you can go that give you a little bit of a sense of what that wilderness was and the beauty of it. And last of all these is we just last month, it was October 20th, we did a Walktober walk along a portion of the Old Connecticut Path from the Benton Ruby Park and Conservation Area in Wellington. We walked up to the Langhammer Conservation Area in Ashford along a portion of the Old Connecticut Path. And we had about 85 people of all ages. And it was heartening to see young children and us mature adults, like all of us here, out together walking. And we talked about some of the history of the people coming down and what it was like. And I also had the good fortune of having a botanist, Gwen Holland, and an ecologist, Charlotte Pyle, come along. So we had really the history and heritage and the environment and presentation in the field. So we hope to have more walks like this where we want people to just get out and experience it, because if you come to see it and experience it directly, then it becomes part of your life. The last thing is my long-term project. This is my long-term retirement project. By 2036, when we're celebrating the 400th anniversary of the migration to Connecticut, it'd be really cool to have a pathway that has some of these natural areas preserved and connected, so that instead of walking and recreating the route and commemorating it as has been done in previous years, they followed the roads, to have people actually walk the woods for parts of the journey so that they can actually enter that experience of the journey to Connecticut. So preserving our heritage And I got into this, I thought I was doing something, my family history, and I found out, well, my family's pretty big. It's our heritage that I've had the good fortune to work with different groups across Connecticut and in Massachusetts. And there seems to be a good partnership that if you can lend a hand in support of your historical societies and your libraries, they've worked well together in helping to bring people together and share the story of the path and the heritage of the people that not just came down to Connecticut, but the people who came to live along the route. And the other groups that I've come to see as invaluable in this preservation of heritage are your local conservation commissions, the land trusts, and the trail organizations. And they're all volunteer organizations. And every time I talk with those folks, they say, this is wonderful, and it brings people out, but we need more people to come and help us along the way. So I would encourage you as part of your long-term assignment. I have quite a few long-term assignments of my own, but I'd encourage you to help lend a hand in your own communities to the historical societies, the libraries, the conservation commissions, and those people who work across the towns on those organizations like the Land Trust and the Trails Organization, like Connecticut Forests and Parks. That there's a wonderful heritage in the land and the people along this route of the path. And I hope that as you leave here today and you do some of your own long-term assignment, the next time you're down at the coffee circle and you pull out your tablet or your smartphone and you say, you know, take a look at this. You out there walking in the woods, what do you think of that? Or, hey, I'd like to go to this place. Take a look at this. That you share the story. Because it's a story worth retelling. And it's a story that you can become part of, and you are part of. So on that, I want to thank you all. For more information, visit the Old Connecticut Path website